Hi everyone. Welcome to the American Studies Association Freedom Course. Today, we're going to be talking about disability justice, COVID, and abolition. We are really excited to bring on to this series amazing thinkers, organizers, writers, lawyers, and kind of our thought leaders around these issues. To begin with, I want to be able to introduce you to our speakers. Let me first begin with Mia Mingus. Mia Mingus is a writer, an educator, and an organizer for disability justice and transformative justice. She is a queer, physically disabled, Korean, transracial, and transnational adoptee raised in the Caribbean. Mia has been involved in transformative justice work for over 15 years and is a founding core member of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, a collective working to build and support transformative justice responses to child sexual abuse. She is a prison abolitionist and a survivor who believes that we must move beyond punishment, revenge, and criminalization if we are ever to effectively break generational cycles of violence and create the world our hearts long for. I am so excited to welcome Mia Mingus to our conversation. She and I are both on Chochenyo Ohlone land. I also want to recognize and bring on Talila T.L. Lewis, who is an abolitionist organizer and community lawyer who works to ground social justice movements and disability justice by helping people recognize the links between ableism and all forms of systemic structural inequity and violence. Lewis's work primarily focuses on abolishing the medical carceral industrial complex, correcting wrongful convictions of deaf, disabled people, and supporting multiply marginalized disabled people affected by all forms of incarceration. Lewis, who taught at Northeastern University School of Law and Rochester Institution of Technology, co-founded the cross-disability abolitionist nonprofit HERD and co-created #Disability Solidarity. Liat is also joining us. Liat Ben Moshe is an activist scholar working at the intersection of incarceration, abolition, and disability/madness. They are an assistant professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago, author of Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization, and Prison Abolition, which is out through University of Minnesota Press 2020. They are also the co-editor of Disability Incarcerated, which is out through Palgrave 2014. For more information, please visit www.liatbenmoshe.com. That's LIATBENMOSHE.com. I am so grateful to have them. I am also grateful to have our two ASL interpreters, Stephanie and Trisha. Thank you so much for your time and your work and your interpretation. I am Dr. Connie Wen, and I am one of the program committee members. I am an Asian woman wearing a black V-neck dress with some sunglasses. Well, no, these aren't sunglasses, regular glasses with my hair tied up. And I welcome you all to our amazing conversation. I'd first love to actually start asking people some questions. I think that'll work. To our folks on the Zoom call, the first question is, what does centering disability justice under a pandemic mean? And I'll leave that up to any of our presenters to start.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is Liat. I can get us started. First of all, I'm a white, femme-looking, lipstick-wearing woman, wearing glasses and a red shirt, and these Madonna mic things that we now use on Zoom. I don't know. Behind me is a Zoom background. that says alternatives to policing based on disability justice. I'm currently situated in Chicago, which is on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, amongst others, like the Miami and Ho-Chunk nations. So the questions, thank you, Connie, for bringing us together. I would start by saying that centering disability justice under a pandemic hopefully means that, I think COVID made visible things that were existing before, but were more under the surface. And things that of course have to do with the connection between race, ableism, class, and a variety of other things. And I think really materialized in what we might able to call neo-eugenics, a new form of eugenics in regards to unequal access to healthcare, which really made visible the practices of triage in hospitals, access to ventilators. So basically putting people with so-called pre-existing medical conditions on the altar to be sacrificed so that people can go back to so-called normal, which a lot of us who are not normal never were a part of or advocated for or wanted to or found desirable or found to be sustainable. And I think it's also really important to note that these pre-existing conditions are not just medical, but of course they're social and economical and political. And in another webinar that I've seen, Kimberly Crenshaw called this white supremacy, disaster white supremacy, which I think is really useful. It's based obviously on this idea of disaster capitalism, how crises are being taken up by the state. And I think there definitely is disaster white supremacy, which is of course very entangled with ableism. The last thing I want to say is that in addition to how COVID made visible existing condition, it also made visible how things that we have advocated for a really long time as disabled and mad people are now just given, like this webinar on Zoom, that we can do things online and we get paid to do things online. And I hope that some of this stays with us. And, in the disability community, the deaf community, we talk about deaf gain or disability gain. So not just hearing loss or kind of the loss of a particular kind of function, which is how some people view disability, but we talk about cultural gain and other gains, gain of knowledge that we have from disability as part of being in disability cultural spaces sometimes. And so I think it's really important to think about how to materialize these kind of disability or access gains. And in addition to really reiterating why wasn't this earlier, to also make sure that we keep it after. Hopefully there'll be an after, honestly. I don't know.
Do any of our other panelists want to address the question? Thank you, Liat. What does centering disability justice under a pandemic mean?
Okay, hi, this is Mia. I am a Korean woman presenting person with a red, what are these called? Headphone wires from my headset. I have large silver hoop earrings on and longer hair that's pulled back on the top. In the background, you can see my office that is partly cut off by a sheet. And I have a black shirt on, a black t-shirt on. Thank you all so much for having me. And so as Connie said, I know our land acknowledgements are the same for the sake of time. I'm going to talk about this question. Thank you, Liat, also for what you offered. I feel like there's so many things. We could talk about this one question forever and, and still not be done. You know, when I think about what it means to center disability justice under a pandemic, there's so many pieces. I think one of the biggest pieces, and Liat talked about this a little bit, is to begin with acknowledging that we haven't been centering it, and that it has not, disability justice has not been centered. And so we have a lot to catch up on. And also to acknowledge, I think similarly, I'll just build on what Liat had said, because I agree with everything. You know, one thing I do want to pull out is not just people who are going to, well, one, we're going to be having so many more disabled folks and folks who have pre-existing conditions, folks who are chronically ill, who are coming out of this pandemic. This pandemic is exploding the disabled population. And, you know, 2 years ago, there was a study done from the CDC that put the statistics at 1 in 4 adults in the US has a disability. And so when we think about a quarter of the population, and we probably know that those numbers are higher, and then compounded by this pandemic, and then of course, not only the pandemic, but also the systems of oppression that we live under and the systems of violence that we live under that are constantly expanding the disabled population, as well as oppressing and threatening and erasing actual disabled folks who are formally disabled. So I think that's one. I also think about, I mean, in addition to the kind of physical impacts of whether it be actual, you know, the virus itself and or the impacts on our body, mind, heart, and spirits from the systems of oppression, I think just across the board, one thing that we can't not talk about is mental health, and just how I think so many people are struggling, so many more people in particular are struggling with mental health. And I know for me, I don't know anybody in my life who is disabled or not, however they identify, who is not struggling with their mental health through this pandemic. Anxiety, whether we're talking about anxiety, depression, et cetera, suicidation, so many things, right? And again, these are compounded by the economic conditions that we're under, people losing their jobs, people not having access to food, to medical care, there's so many other pieces that compound what we're going through. But I think about how many folks are living through this pandemic right now with intense mental health issues and struggles, as well as how many folks by the time we're done with it, because we know that shelter in place and quarantine those things are not ending anytime soon. And so I think for so many folks having to adjust, and also compounded by all of the things that we're now asked to do as we're sheltering in our homes. And I know that, like, you know, a lot of folks some people don't have the luxury to work remotely, and for all of the folks who have had to figure out how to do that, especially I think about folks with kids in particular and family members with elders living in their household, just how much of a strain and like the pressure and stress in terms of our mental health. The last thing that I'll say is that, you know, I think that what centering disability justice means in a pandemic is that we really center things like interdependence, care, sustainability. I think that masks are a really great illustration of our lack of interdependence, that literally we have to understand that we are all interconnected and that we are all interdependent with each other. And masks to me represent that I wear a mask so that I can protect you all, anybody that I come in contact with. And what we're seeing with folks who are refusing to do that, right, is this sense of US Western independence, myth of independence, right, and entitlements, and oftentimes white folks in particular who are refusing to embrace that. And to me, I feel like this is merely a reflection of the incredibly able supremacist society that we live in. And of course, then compounded by many, many other systems of oppression. You know, the thing to me about disability justice that I think is so key for people to understand is one of the reasons why disability justice was created, and why, you know, I feel honored to have been part of that forefront of that creation with many other folks, is that we are talking not only just about disability and just about ableism, that disability justice is a multi-issue framework. It is an intersectional framework. And so there is not going to be any discussion about ableism or disability without also talking about white supremacy, settler colonialism, etc. So I'll just stop there.
Hey, this is TL speaking. I am currently joining virtually from occupied, unceded Piscataway and Anacostan homeland, colonially known as Washington, D.C. I'm wearing a black beanie, a black sweater with a high neck, maroon shirt. I'm a black person, non-binary, with circle rim glasses, and I'm seated in front of a gray wall on a gray couch with a bookshelf with photos and books behind me. Responding to the question about disability justice in the time of a pandemic, I think for me, the critical piece is unearthing the present and the presence of the past. So like, people often are talking about eugenics or the violences that exist in the United States and that are the United States, as though these are things of the past when they've never left. I think that's really, really important. So really unearthing that and then undoing that temporally and then like physically in every sense of the word, and making known that past is present.
So it seems as though we've temporarily disconnected from TL. I think, and perfect, they're back.
This is TL testing sound. Okay, one moment, please. This is TL. Sorry about that. I had a technical issue. So I think I was talking about making known that the past is present. I talk about the history of the United States / presence of the United States as a race disability or disability race history present. That you can't discuss one without discussing the other, that the effects of mass genocide that are continuing, of mass deprivation, mass violence, mass neglect, and trauma, quite literally is disability. And I think Mia spoke to that a little bit earlier, so I won't delve too far into that. The other thing that I keep together is the medical carceral complex. So often people separate the carceral system, and most people think of carcerality in terms of just prisons and jails, and then think of the medical complex as often just hospitals. but I actually can't separate those. And I think disability justice demands that we not. What do I mean by that? When we think about the effects of the assignment of value to people based on societal standards of decency, brilliance, and other metrics, we understand that people in positions of power have created, quite literally constructed, disability, but we also know that deprivation is a cause and consequence of disability. And so whether that's resource segregation, racial segregation, disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards, for example, based on these decisions about who gets resources that are based in race and ability and disability and class and all of these other things that we know exist in the US context and other contexts as well. We have to remember that people don't survive those things without becoming disabled. That said, we also have to look at epidemics that have existed time immemorial in the carceral context, and I include plantations in carceral context. I include asylums and poorhouses and quote unquote orphanages and group facilities and nursing facilities are just a few examples where what we know is that people are congregated in those spaces. Those folks are deemed inferior for various reasons, often constructed by society. And those people are left without material supports that are necessary to ensure that they can survive and thrive. And so when you look into carceral spaces, what we know are that epidemics have existed there in the US context. And also when we think about ghettos that have been created and reservations that have been created, those are carceral spaces also, insofar as the folks are put there intentionally for the purpose of extraction, experimentation, deprivation, and death. And so the work that I do doesn't disconnect this stolen bodies and criminalized minds and the diagnosing of dissent or disease. And so when you look into carceral spaces, you find that folks right now, prior to COVID, disproportionately are having all manner of disabilities and diseases, whether that be due to conditions of confinement related to mental health that develops as a result of the violence, or due to deprivation of nutritious food, which leads to renal disease, diabetes, heart failure. Hep C is rampant in all of our carceral spaces, HIV and AIDS. We could literally run down the list. That has always existed. I think the difference in COVID is that the dead bodies are piling up outside of the walls of carceral spaces, so people are forced to pay attention. And so I think I'd like to make the connection between our histories and present as related to race, disability, class history, and acknowledge the grotesque intersected violences of racism, classism, and ableism. And I think that's what is demanded of us when we're talking about acknowledging disability justice in the midst of a pandemic. It's acknowledging that we've existed in this realm for a very, very long time.
This is Mia. I just want to add on to that. Thank you, TL, so much of that. Oh my gosh, yes. And I just want to add that, you know, one thing that has come up for me as a disabled person during this pandemic, as somebody who was a disabled child in particular, who was formally marked as a disabled child, meaning that I had an obvious disability and that I was exposed to the medical industrial complex and had experienced tremendous abuse, is also this tension, I think, of living in this pandemic time with, I know for me in the beginning, it was really hard for me when nurses and doctors and medical professionals were being put on pedestals and given such appreciation, which I understand, and I think as somebody who has firsthand experienced the violence of the medical industrial complex. And to me, I include prisons and, population control, different entities inside of that as well. As somebody who has experienced that firsthand and who also knows the kind of violence and just terribleness that happens that in the ways that communities get targeted by the medical industrial complex, that tension has always been really hard. And then of course, compounded by the fact that so many of us across demographics, like not just disabled people, but we're talking about Black, Indigenous, people of color, we're talking about queer and trans folks, right? And obviously those groups are not mutually exclusive. But so many of us don't have very valid fears of seeking medical attention. And so the issue I think that Liat was talking about in terms of triage is absolutely important, and the way that eugenics plays out around that. And I think that so many of us are already terrified to seek medical help, whether we have insurance or not, health insurance or not. And that kind of that tension and that fear being exacerbated by this pandemic, I think has been incredibly difficult for so many of us who are survivors of violence and abuse, in particular sexual abuse as well, in the medical industrial complex.
Yeah, if I can just build on that for a moment before we go to the next question. I think it's really, to connect, Tia, what you were saying, and Mia, something that really kind of resonated with me is this idea of if we connect the carceral and the medical, as all of our work does, all of us on this call, including Connie, it's really important to think not just of the lack of access to medicalization, but also I want to bring in words like treatment or corrections, right? I mean, this idea that that some people have, usually outside of the disability communities, or people who are not politicized as disabled or mad or deaf, this idea that treatment is somehow benevolent, and we need to talk about more access to, to treatment and so on, I think is part of the problem, obviously, and not the solution. I mean, the concept itself, treatment, corrections, and so on, are incredibly problematic. And I agree with you completely that this has been kind of a both-and situation, both to talk about the lack of access to resources, including resources to be alive, but then also the unequalness of things like treatment and the kind of treatment that are proposed.
So I want to thank our panelists for helping us to think through the what it means to center disability justice during this pandemic, but also at the same time, I feel as though you all are expanding our understanding of the impacts of this pandemic, and also you're calling to question the institutions and the conditions that render people disabled and their access for support and services. You're also talking about different sites of carcerality and captivity and the needs that come from being in these spaces. That goes to the second question then. What is a disability justice framework for us to understand abolition? Because this is like the biggest thing right now. People are talking so much about abolition. What's an analysis from a disability justice framework to tackle that or address that movement and the need for it? Let's start with anyone who pops up first. Thanks.
All right, fine. We become our own students. Okay, so I just want to say two things, and then continue kind of our conversation. So to me, two examples of what would, or three maybe, three examples of disability justice framework for abolition. The first one is the one I always talk about, which is deinstitutionalization. So the reason why I think it's incredibly important is because deinstitutionalization to me was a lot of things, and I mean deinstitutionalization as the movement and the closure of psychiatric hospitals and residential institutions for people with labels of intellectual or developmental disabilities. And it happened on dual tracks, so it didn't happen at the same time for both of those populations. But the movements themselves, to me, were a lot of things, including shared praxis for abolition. So there weren't movements that talked about reform of institutions and reform of psychiatric hospitals, but the closure of them, and basically ways for people with disabilities, including complex needs, to live in the community. And of course, not all of that happened, but as a vision, it was an abolitionary vision, or at least that's how I see it. And so to me, it's not a blueprint, of course, but it's a historical horizon. I don't remember how TL said it, but it was perfect. Presence in the past or something like that, that we can learn from and kind of reactivate, because it happened. And it happened in the US, and it happened in some of our lifetime, or a generation before us, for those of us who are younger. And it's something we can learn from in terms of our current abolitionary movement. People didn't call themselves disability justice, so that's not what I'm saying. This is movements, that happened the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. But I think it's activating a similar framework for liberation that I think is reminiscent to some of the things that we're talking about, including some of the examples that were brought so far, interdependence, and so on. And the second thing I would say is that, to me, a disability justice understanding of abolition would understand abolition as something that is kind of an object of trial and error, and something that's unfinished in a good way. And this is how it happened also in deinstitutionalization as well. So it's something that builds the world while we're living in the world. So this idea that, okay, let's wait till all the conditions are ready, and then we can start talking about decarcerating, we can start talking about abolition of carceral facilities, we can start releasing people, but we have to wait. Deinstitutionalization didn't happen that way. And I think that that's actually an advantage of that framework, because guess what? I mean, we can wait forever. And the we also is different, right? I mean, the people who are telling us to wait. For us who are incarcerated, or for us who have loved ones who are incarcerated, and I mean incarcerated in a variety of things, not just prisons, we're of course not waiting. Nobody's waiting. So, this idea that we need to, I think is a form of violence. The third thing that I would say, and then I'll stop, is that a bunch of us, including some people here, wrote a document which can be found on a website, which is, the website is called Abolition and Disability Justice. One word, abolitionanddisabilityjustice.com. And in that document, we talk about what we think a disability justice framework for abolition is, and also some things we should avoid through that framework. For example, frameworks that still surveil people with disabilities or people in general, like registries, mandatory reporting, things that coerce quote unquote treatment on people, things that expose people to the child welfare system, and a variety of other harmful systems. So in other words, what we try to do is to write a statement against this idea that if we only weaponize social workers or do more training for police officers about mental health crisis, will somehow, we grounded disability. Of course, not the justice part, but, we did something with disability, and, it might be a non-reformist reform or something like that. So in our statement, we object to those kind of moves that really show the connections between what TL was calling the connection between the medical and the carceral, which also, of course, exists in a lot of Mia, your writing as well. So how do we reject those and still offer a particular framework? So I really recommend people go to the website and look.
Are there other panelists who would like to chime in as well?
This is TL. I can go ahead and respond. I recently, can you hear me? Yeah, I recently published an article, and I think the title, let me see, is Disability Justice is an Essential Part of Abolishing Police and Prisons, where I talk about the fact that abolitionist movements must contend with how disability and ableism interact with criminalization, carceral systems, medical systems, if not to continue spinning wheels. So if they do not do that, the work will be in vain. And the reason for that is because the United States government and its corporations have always utilized constructed ideas around disability, criminality, alongside concepts of race and class, quite literally to cage, criminalize, and disappear its society's undesirables. And so when abolitionists don't have this framework from which to view and understand carcerality, this much broader framework to understand what carcerality looks like, these systems, the powers that be, simply recategorize people based on some other designation. Oh, they need to get clean. Oh, they need treatment. And not understanding those histories, Frederick Douglass said that this is emancipation was just on the horizon, emancipation of enslavement. And a lot of abolitionists came to Frederick Douglass and said, hey, like, we've achieved our goal, it's right on the horizon, great job, everybody, high five. And Frederick Douglass said, no, we need to be ever present and even more aware now than before. And his question was, we have to pay attention, because in what new skin will the old snake come forth? And within 11 years, he had done his own research and figured out what the new snake skin looked like. And it looked like carceral, convict leasing, and other carceral spaces. And that's important because, again, too few abolitionists, traditional abolitionists, have this broader understanding of what incarceration actually looks like. And importantly, I think both Mia and Liat have alluded to this, but I'll be a little bit more direct about it in this piece. I talk about it there's this conflation of treatment and cure and rehabilitation. And there's also a designation of disability for folks who are literally resisting, specifically Black and Indigenous folks who are resisting corporate and state and government violence. So for instance, Black folks who were escaping enslavement were deemed insane and criminal simultaneously, deemed that they needed help and needed to be cured for thinking about freedom, and also deemed criminal. Folks who were engaged in work stoppages who were Black and Indigenous were also deemed criminal and insane simultaneously. But the specific thing I want to name is that US boards of corrections, state boards of corrections, and boards of charities were quite literally together. They were the same thing. Kids who didn't have parents, folks who were labeled criminal, elderly folks, folks with addictions, low and no income folks were all categorized in the same groups. That's here in the United States, and Black folks who were formerly enslaved. One thing I want to name, since we're on this chat, that I want to challenge white disabled folks around is this naming of particular laws like the ugly laws. Ugly laws were quite literally set up to entrap and ensnare mostly Black and Indigenous and so-called brown people who were not white at the time, folks who were low or no income. And these laws criminalize begging upon the street for folks who were maimed, crippled, deformed, their language, not mine, and could penalize them sometimes by fines and sometimes by incarceration. And all of those carceral spaces, whether it was formal prisons, orphanages, poorhouses, the job of the folks who were incarcerated there was hard labor, plantations as well, asylums, all of those places people moved between and around, and they were supposed to be engaged in hard labor to inure to the benefit of the corporations, the planter elite, or government. So I think that's what I'll say for right now. Just understanding those connections are critical. Disenfranchisement of disabled folks and folks labeled criminal, all under the same law. All of these things are so interrelated that if we address one part without addressing the other, we really are failing the entire movement. And then the last thing, I promise, is what we learned from abolition of enslavement and deinstitutionalization is that to release folks from incarceration without providing material supports in all realms of life, whether that be mental health, food, housing, clean water, all the things, to release them without material supports is simply to create another system of violence that's going to find another reason to cage and incarcerate folks. So those are my few things, and I wonder what Mia thinks on this topic too.
Thanks, TL. Thanks, Liat. Oh my gosh, so many wonderful things. So I don't want to repeat things that people have said, but yes, yes, yes to all of it. I was like a fangirl over here, like, yes, yes. The piece that I want to add that I feel like is really critical. So first and foremost, I just want to say that I've been saying this my whole life, but I'm like, as we fight for the right to receive care, we also have to fight for the right to refuse care. And, you know, whenever I think a pandemic in particular sets us up in a very precarious way in terms of what's coming down the pike and who gets what kind of care, right? And especially who gets to determine what kind of care they get. So I want to say that out loud because I think that oftentimes we get so lost in fighting for the right to receive care that we forget that there's so many people who have unjust care, quote unquote, forced upon them. The piece that I want to pull out in terms of abolition in particular is one, there's so many things. One, the history, the particular disability specific history that prisons, of course, like what we have now in terms of prisons, police, etc., all of that has legacies, and slavery has legacies in colonization, of course. And I do think it's important also to name the disability-specific legacy around mental institutions in particular, and that for so long, that was where those used to be the jails and the prisons, right? That was where all kinds of folks just got thrown in. And whether we're talking about people who were thrown into those because of white supremacy, because of patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera. And so just wanting to name that, to me, I feel like all disability organizations and groups should have abolition as part of their work. I think, to me, I feel like it's not even a question around like, how does disability justice like interact with the abolition? To me, disability justice is abolition. And abolition is disability justice, that it's such a huge part of all of our history, but in particular disabled people, that I want to just name that, because I find, for me, I have come into abolition, and like being a disabled person was such a huge part of that. But I want to name what like TL was starting to talk about, right? In terms of a different skin, right? That our communities are not perfect either. And so it's not enough just to only the work to deinstitutionalize folks, right? It's not enough, because we can't guarantee that people are going to be safe outside of these institutions either. The work that I do, the forms of violence that I focus on in my work, in transformative justice work, are the violences between each other and inside of our communities. Yes, we have a ton of violence coming at us from the state and coming at us from outside our communities, and we have so much violence and harm happening inside of our communities as well. And for so many disabled people, if we expand this understanding of incarceration to also include the disabled folks who are locked up in the back rooms of their families' homes, who are, bound to their bedrooms and not allowed to leave because of stigma, because of lack of access, because of ableism, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, I feel like so much of this question around abolition is also, what are we building towards? What are we building that is, yeah, we can shut down these terrible institutions and we can fight against all of the things that we know are damaging and threatening our communities, and to me, a huge part of abolition, I think of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, that such a big part of abolition is the presence of values, the presence of the life and the liberation that we are all longing for and want to build. And to me, that is where disability justice also comes in, because disability justice is not only a framework to understand all of the terror that we face and the oppression and the violence that we face and all of the systems that are targeting us, but it's also, to me, a framework about what is it that we're actually building, and how do we look at things like care collectives? How do we look at things like mutual aid? How do we look at interdependence work? How do we look at community building work and even just support that is happening within disabled communities? And I will add also our communities, because it's not just disabled communities by themselves, because none of us are only disabled people. We have other communities that we are connected to. And so we can't only think, again, an intersectional framework, right? Multi-issue politic. That part of what, to me, disability justice also means is that we have justice for disabled people and our communities. And that means, again, that we have to look much more broadly and understand how ableism gets leveraged by white supremacy, for example, which is what we're seeing in this pandemic, how ableism gets leveraged by capitalism, so that the people who are being most impacted are Black, Indigenous people of color, are poor folks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so to me, I feel excited in turn about like, what can we build inside of our communities, so that if we can get more and more folks out of institutions, out of prisons, out of jails, out of detention centers, that they can actually have us, that we can say this is a safer and better place to be, right? That this is a place where you can get your needs met. This is a place where you will be valued. And that for so many folks and in our communities, we know that we're not there yet. We know that we haven't made that shift, right? And that even disabled people who are not formally incarcerated are completely isolated by their communities and don't have any resources in terms of community as a resource, in terms of relationship and love as a resource, right? That it's beyond just budget, worrying about budget cuts and of course those are important, but that it's also thinking about how do we live a dignified life.
So this is Connie. So all of that was sheer brilliance. We have a few more minutes, about 6 more minutes for us to think through the intersections, or how does a disability justice framework help us to tend to the needs of this pandemic and the call for abolition. You all have addressed it throughout this hour. I hear you expanding or redefining to some extent the carceral state, the numerous institutions. You've addressed some of the needs that extend beyond what I think conventional abolitionists have been espousing. So I'd love for you to tell us, how does disability justice help us to think through and address the intersections of COVID, this pandemic, and carcerality? And what are we to do with disability justice to help us envision and create a different future? TL, do you mind if you address this first? And then we'll go to Mia and Liat. Thank you.
Yeah, this is TL. I think really briefly what we know is that economic, racial, any form of justice demands healing justice, requires disability justice. Like, you can't have any of those without disability justice. And so when we're thinking about how we right now have an opportunity to really bring to the fore this framework, this politic, this way of life that changes everything we do, how we behave and interact with one another, what we deem as acceptable behavior and violences, which should be none. It's an understanding that there is no separation between these random classes of carcerality, disability, race. All of these things intersect and intertwine and feed upon one another to allow the state, to allow corporations to continue to lay waste to our communities. And so Mia is right. It's that deinstitutionalization alone is not sufficient on the disability rights side. Abolition alone without a disability justice lens and kind of the racial and economic justice front doesn't do justice to the needs of everyone either. It's about understanding that all of these communities are fighting for the same kind of liberation, and that the kind of liberation that we need centers the margins of the margins. And that is what, at its heart, at its core, disability justice does. So I think for me, it's understanding all of that simultaneously. And in terms of the pandemic, it's understanding that, sure, there will always be diseases, et cetera, but it's humans who create the conditions for those diseases to continue to proliferate within particular parts of society and in particular communities. And the question is, do we accept that violence? How do we challenge that violence as well? And I think disability justice is a great framework in place to start and to work. And of course, it'll never be ending. It's ongoing work in perpetuity. So hopefully this has been helpful for folks. And I'd love to hear Liat and Mia's responses as well.
Hi, this is Mia. There's so many things I want to say, but I'll just center in on these two pieces. One is that it doesn't matter what community or movement you're working with or for or part of, disabled people are part of your community, like, period. And the sooner you can understand that the better off you will be in terms of fighting for liberation for your peoples. So I think, because, you know, if we look at this pandemic and we look at the way that in particular elder folks were just sacrificed, like just blatantly, no trying to hide it at all, just completely thrown to the wolves, right? And we think about all of our communities have elders that are a part of our communities. So disability and ableism are key to understanding this moment and understanding what has been going on, as well as in particular understanding the ways that ableism happens and is hidden in plain sight all the time. Like that it's just a part of how the machine rolls, and we're just all supposed to pretend to not acknowledge it. And so part of what I think these frameworks can offer to us at this time is also to help to uncover and reveal a lot of things that maybe weren't as recognizable to us before, but once we understand them, we can never not see them again. And that the last thing is that if we center disabled people, if we center Black, Indigenous, people of color that are disabled, we will be, in particular, though, that community, we will be building something, a future and a life and a world that is useful and helpful and supportive of all of us. Because I think the thing about disability that is so that is so unique in so many ways and is so tied into class in particular and poverty is that the way we treat disabled people functions as reinforcement to people's stigma and ableism and able supremacy. And so if we can take that away, if we can center folks who are disabled, who are the most marginalized within the disability community in particular, and that includes like folks with intellectual disabilities and cognitive disabilities as well, that then we will be, in a sense, you know, we will be putting those most impacted at the center, and we'll be building something that actually could help us all in the long run.
All right, I'll just close by saying, first of all, that it's, thanks Connie for bringing us together. I guess my last thought in the last minute we have is to connect this to a little bit of gratitude to that I have towards one of my academic homes, which is American Studies, who's doing this webinar, or that Connie brought this idea to, at least of this, the freedom webinars, freedom courses, whatever they are. And I think to me, the thing that I learned from American Studies that I think is related to this question is something that I want to kind of push for particularly disability rights frameworks that think about kind of reform and abolition in particular ways, is that, you know, the moment of COVID is also the moment of intense racial uprising. Some will say some of the biggest, or almost as prevalent as the 70s. And I think to not kind of take note of that connection, of course, is problematic. And what I learned from American Studies is this framework from Rod Ferguson, Ferguson. Rod is R-O-D. This framework of queer of color critique, and to take it to kind of disability or disability mad of color critique, I think what it would teach us that the state cannot fix what the state intentionally broke. So to come to the state with these kind of demands of please give us so-and-so, please include us in so-and-so, is not not only not the solution, it's exactly the problem. And it's the problem we're perpetuating. And it's, of course, the problem that Indigenous Black people and people of color have been talking about for a really long time, which is the problem of state violence. So to not understand institutionalization as part of incarceration is problematic, but also to not understand institutionalization, including in nursing homes and other facilities, group homes, as state violence is also very problematic. And I think the moment that we're in of COVID and racial uprising and people's reckoning with abolition, I think brings all of those three together for me in that framework.
So thank you, Mia, Liat, and TL, and our interpreters. I just want to say that you all, the work that you're doing and your thinking and organizing around carcerality and the pandemic, illnesses, disabilities is so profound and so important for us to kind of to center. I forgot to mention this is Connie. It's so important for us to center because we've all been doing, a lot of us have been doing this abolitionist work. Many of us have been doing abolitionist work. Those who are watching have probably been doing this work for 20 plus years, and then some of us are new to the work. And I think what our panelists are offering is that we center our analyses and our efforts from a disability justice framework, because then we will best be able to honor those that are impacted at multiple levels, and then we'll also be able to honor the wisdom and the politics around creating conditions for everyone's survivability and our abilities to thrive together. I really appreciate the points around creating safe conditions for our communities, honoring our communities, the legacies by which this entire kind of nation, its institutions have been based upon. I appreciate the emphasis on state violence. I appreciate the emphasis on how the state and its violent institutions will manifest in different ways if we don't address the conditions that create all of this. I thank you all so much. I don't know if there are other things you all want to say to us. I know this is the first time for a couple of you all to be on this together. If you all want to kind of come on and show your screens, or TL, I see yours. Do you have something else that you want to add? And then I'll...
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
I wanted to say, you know, TL, if you have anything, and I see Mia, Liat, did you want to share something, TL?
This is TL. Yeah, just one quick thing. I just, we didn't have as much time as I think any of the three of us individually or collectively would have liked, or four of us, I guess. But we didn't really get to capitalism and money motives around all of these violences, the criminalization, the commodification of non-desirable bodies or expendable people and minds. But that's something that I think is important to name as something that we didn't quite hit on today, but it is kind of it is quite literally at the heart of a lot of the capitalist, imperialist, colonialist, racist, ableist things that we've been discussing today. That's all I wanted to name: capitalism and money, commodification.
This is Mia. One thing that I want to name is so many things I want to name, but in particular, it's just that I know we've been talking a lot about racial justice, you know, and like ending white supremacy. And I just want to really just underscore that to me, like anytime I'm working with any BIPOC communities, like it's not a coincidence that, what am I trying to say? What I want to say is that it's not even just that there are already disabled people that are part of those communities, but it's also that the way that ableism gets leveraged by white supremacy and capitalism means that again, that to me, disability is just a part of what it means to be Black, Indigenous, people of color. Like I just feel like it's even like the bond, the intertwinedness is even closer than just like, oh yeah, and there's some disabled people over there who look like me. Like I want to get deeper into that, and I wish we had more time to really talk about the ways that, you know, what happens to bodies that don't have access to healthcare, that are constantly under surveillance, that are, you know, like I wish we had more time to get into the systemic nature of able supremacy, and particularly how it plays out in connection with other systems of oppression.
This is Liat. I don't have much to add except gratitude, and thank you all for sharing space. Thanks for Connie for bringing us together, and sounds like I'm looking forward to the sequel.
Thank you, everyone. And this is Connie. I think you're right that there is much more. We do need more time to talk about the role of capitalism. And Mia, your point around not the unothering of disabilities, and kind of bringing disabilities back into our beings for BIPOC communities is really, 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 really important. I feel like that can be the sequel, but also I know that that's ensconced in a lot of the ways that you all kind of do your work anyways. So I'd love for folks who are paying attention to today to please visit the work of Mia Mingus, the work of T.L. Lewis, the work of Liat Ben Moshe. Please visit their websites, read their books, read their articles, go to their workshops, because they'll be doing this work ongoingly. And I look forward to learning more. Thank you so much, and good night, everyone. Thank you, or bye, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you.